Sure, great. Well, thank you. First of all, thanks so much for having me here, and thank you, Randy, for the invitation. I always appreciate that the AFT is willing to engage people that are on the other side of the spectrum. Just so you know where I'm coming from, I am a conservative, but I'm also a never-Trumper. There's like 8 of us left, I think, out there. I think maybe I'll start calling myself a John Roberts conservative. I kind of like the ring of that. Anyways, but I am a card-carrying member of the education reform movement, and we will get to that. Let me say just a couple of things. Thank you, I appreciate it. What Domingo totally made a ton of sense. I mean, I think, look, when we talk about how this is playing out in the states, of course we have to talk about 50 different states with very different political coloration. I think it's absolutely true that in those deep blue places, like in New Jersey or Chicago, that the progressive movement gaining strength, absolutely. It means that the folks that are fighting against, say, charter schools are gaining an upper hand. So, I think that's true. But, of course, it plays out differently in other places. The Upshot had a great article yesterday about the dynamic with this election in the suburbs, and showing that, of course, we know that this election was largely fought in the suburbs, and that there were a bunch of these congressional districts that flipped, especially on the strength of kind of white college-educated women who voted very heavily for Democrats, in part out of reaction to the president. But when you look down ballot and at some of the different issues in referendum, there's some evidence that these voters in the suburbs still are hardly progressive, that they're still in many ways quite conservative around things like taxation, like schools, right? And so I think it of course, this is going to play out differently in different places. In terms of the impact of the election, as is always the case, almost always the case in American education, on a national level, education was not a big issue. I came of age at a time when we were so excited back in 2000 that education was a big issue. I can still remember George W. Bush and Al Gore debating what to do about chronically low-performing schools at a presidential debate, and they each had interesting, thoughtful answers about that. Feels like a long time since education has had that kind of prominence. And so the blue wave, of course, was largely not about education. It was about Trump, about healthcare and other issues. At the state level, it played an issue, especially spending. No doubt, some of the draconian cuts that had happened in places like Kansas, that was a factor. A big win for the unions and other education groups in Wisconsin. The Arizona state superintendent race, the California state superintendent race. So certainly some big victories there. But, the reform crowd can claim some victories as well. People that support school choice point to Florida, where DeSantis, pulled out in a very close election. And, interesting article in the Wall Street Journal making the case that if you look into the data, there was a surprising number of African-American women who voted for DeSantis, and the theory being that they may have kids who are benefiting from the private school voucher program, the scholarship program, that these voucher moms may have put them over the top. Kind of interesting. Also big victories in Georgia. And then you look at the sort of reform-minded Democrats for Education Reform. Charlie Barone has a piece out today in Education Next, pointing to Colorado, Jared Polis winning there. Andrew Cuomo in New York, of course, has been very strong on charters as well as teacher evaluation policies. So, everybody can point to some places where their team won. But what does this mean going forward? What I've been arguing in some of my writing is that we are at a point right now where there's not an appetite for big new policy initiatives in education. And that's reason to celebrate in many quarters. We have reached a place where after all these waves of reform, No Child Left Behind, Common Core, Race to the Top, the teacher evaluation push, partly because of the election of Donald Trump in 2016, but I think partly just because of exhaustion with all of that. We are at a place where there is not the political appetite for a big new idea or big new push on education reform. And so, again, for those of you that disagree with a lot of those policies, you can claim victory on that. Now, what I would say, though, is that we also don't have a big appetite for pushing all of this stuff backwards. We have, in a sense, a homeostasis. So take charter schools. What you see across the country is that the growth in charter schools has slowed quite a bit. But nobody seriously thinks that charter schools where they exist are going to go away, right? Or that their footprint is necessarily going to shrink. They're just not growing as fast as they were a few years ago. when they had more wind at their back with President Barack Obama in support of them, with Race to the Top and other things. Likely with testing and accountability. In large part because of the federal law, the Every Student Succeeds Act, we still have annual testing. That's not going away. We still have these accountability systems that are largely based around test scores. That's not going away, at least until that federal law is reauthorized. Given congressional dysfunction, I don't think any of us think that's going to happen anytime soon. So, we are at a place right now where there's some stability, some policy stability. We've got accountability systems, but they're lighter touch than they used to be, right? Not a big focus on mandatory interventions in low-performing schools, more up to the states about what to do with schools that are chronically low-performing. And accountability systems that I think have gotten better. The standards are better, the tests are better, the accountability systems are fairer, they look more at growth over time, at least in most states. We're finally seeing some accountability systems where high-poverty schools can actually do well if they're making growth. So that's in place. Charter schools and other forms of choice that are here to stay, but not growing as fast. Teacher evaluation systems in most states that have been, really where that has gone back to a place where it's more about providing feedback. Still a few places where test scores are a factor, but that's becoming less and less common. And so that's where we're at right now. And, what I would argue is that we have an opportunity where, regardless of how you feel about all these policy issues, to say, we're going to have some time when schools and educators, teachers, are not going to have a new reform coming at them every year or two. And this is a golden opportunity to focus on improving practice. The hope of all of these reforms, I can tell you from people who developed them, was that schools would respond in positive ways and look for evidence-based practices and build capacity and get better at what they're supposed to do, serve kids better, get better outcomes. There's still a lot of work to be done on that. The AFD has done great work on helping schools implement the Common Core, for example, but we still know that there are a vast majority of teachers out there who report not having aligned curricular materials to the standards. That's crazy. We're almost we're over 8 years out. There are now really good curriculum that have been developed by nonprofits, by some of the traditional publishers, open educational resources. Teachers are still saying they're going to Pinterest to download lesson plans. This is insane, right? So that's an area where we can focus. Better research coming out recently about coaching making a big impact if done well. That's another change that's happened. A lot of our schools now have these instructional coaches, these literacy coaches, math coaches. They have great potential to help our schools improve. So, I would not suspect that this moment's going to last forever. Politicians cannot resist getting involved in schools and passing new policies. And you can't blame them. If they look out and they see that we continue to flatline in terms of outcomes, that we continue to have so many young people who graduate high school not ready for anything of what's next, politicians are going to be back at this again. And I would not be surprised in Washington if we see more interest down the road and back to a more Washington-centric, top-down approach to reform. But while we have this moment, I would argue let's do all we can to take advantage of it, focus on practice, focus on getting better. And if you want to keep policymakers at bay, the best thing we can do is to show them, hey, we got this. Schools are improving. We don't need another No Child Left Behind coming at us anytime soon.